Hello and welcome back to this series on Godot character controllers. Today we build a very simple third-person character controller. We mostly focus on code and make our player move with only 13 lines of code. This video builds on episode 1 of this series from last week. If you haven't watched it yet, please do so. So this is the scene where we have left off. The first thing we do, we remove our player. And we're going to duplicate the player scene into a 3P player scene that we're going to use for the third-person player. And we link that back into our world. Nothing's changed really. We're going to rename that in third-person player, if I can write. We're going to open that and we're going to also rename that into third-person player. We're going to save this. Now we change the camera. We go to our third-person player and we move the camera back and up and we rotate it so it looks down at our player. So we turn that off and finally add a script to the third-person player. We keep the name and we make sure that we have the empty template. Now we will create the most basic character controller with only 13 lines of code. If you just want the code, copy it from the description. Here it is, it's yours, you're done. Congratulations, see you next week. But wait. If you want to know how this works and how to construct it, keep watching. My approach will be a bit different to most other YouTube videos. Most others drop the code as fast as possible. But instead, I will set the target and build the code backwards. Bear with me. But first, requirements. Our third-person player should only do two things. First, move forward, backward, left and right reliably and from a fixed camera perspective. And second, be affected by gravity, like so many things. So we need 3 lines of code here first with some explaining before we can start building our code backwards. The first one is extends KinematicBody. This one was generated because we attached a script to our KinematicBody or our player. We can now access all the attributes and methods from this class and we can add or extend to it, and we will use that very soon. The second one is a function, physics process delta, and I just put a pass in here to make it shut up and so I don't get any error messages. Oh, I already got it. Okay. So our code logic will be placed in this physics process method. This method is called automatically as part of this game loop that we talked about in the scene video. So this method is useful when physically moving a character or anything physical really. Placing our code in there means it runs a set number of times per second, so usually 60 times, and perfectly constant, perfectly frame independent and perfectly synchronized. Delta is the time difference between this time when it's running and the last time it was running. So it runs 60 times a second, so delta is 1 divided by 60, which is 0.01666. Please don't think about the devil. I will link up some video descriptions from another YouTube channel that I like very much, Godot Tutorials, that explains the physics process function in a lot more detail, and also the game loop in a lot more detail. I link that up in the description. Please also see my Everything is a Scene video that I made earlier. Let's move on. And moving is a good keyword because we want to move a character. So when I type in move underscore, I get access to all the move functions from KinematicBody. Move and collide, that is when I move an object and I collide with something, it will stop. Move and slide, when it collides with something, it will try to slide around it. But it will also slide down slopes, for example. And the third one basically is the same as move and slide, but I can snap it to something like the floor or the wall or the ceiling or wherever I want to have a stable ground on. And then it will not make me slide down a slope, for example. So I pick this third one and I get a list of all the things, all the parameters that it wants. It wants a linear velocity or velocity, which is a 3D vector. It wants a snap vector, that's also a 3D vector. It wants me to tell it where up is, or up direction. And it wants me to give it a Boolean if it should stop on slopes. And I just typed that in as well. Okay, let's work that. We already have an error here stating that velocity isn't declared. So we remember velocity was, go here, velocity was a vector 3. So we need to initialize velocity. Velocity, and that is a vector 3. And because it is nothing yet, we set it to 0. So that's velocity. Then we have snap. This is something where we want to snap it to. And we define that this is also a vector 3. And we want to snap to the floor, which is down. That's snap. Then we have the up direction. We don't really need a variable for that. We define up. It is always, for the entire game and the entire tutorial, it is always up. So that's the up direction. And stop on slopes, I want to set that to true just in case there is one, but the level actually doesn't have one, so it shouldn't matter. So what is velocity? Velocity is direction multiplied by speed. Direction is a vector. It points where I'm going. Speed is a so-called scalar. It tells me the magnitude, the strength of which I'm going. So I need a directional vector. It said var direction, and I know it's a vector 3. I don't know what it is right now, so I set it to 0. And I also have a variable speed, and this is a number. And I set this column here because I wanted to determine the type right away. I do the same thing here for the other ones. So how do I get a direction? This character controller determines direction based on keystrokes, and there is a class called input. This input class has a method called getAxis, which requires a negative and a positive action. A negative basically turns the return value into a -1. The positive action turns it into a +1. And both are being added, so they're adding up to 0. If I press both keys, it adds up to 0. If I press no keys, it also adds up to 0. So I get basically the direction on a single axis in both directions. It also negates itself if I press multiple keys at the same time, which can happen. So because of that, I'm picking here left and right as my left and right movement. And this is my direction in the x-axis. And then I have the same for the z-axis. Again, I ask my input class to give me the axis, but this time I go up and down. And then I have my direction for x and for z. So now I can basically take here this direction, but I take the x value and make that velocity for x. And likewise, I do the same thing for z. That's the other direction I can walk on the ground, and I pick the direction z. Direction x, direction z becomes velocity x, velocity z. So please keep in mind that if your character moves kind of opposite way, then you would want to exchange here left with right or exchange up with down. Based on your camera position, this can be opposite. So just keep that in mind. I want to do one more thing. Velocity can also change in altitude. So go up the y-axis. Y-axis goes basically at higher altitude or lower altitude. We want the character to be able to fall down, and that is gravity. And of course, it already complains that it doesn't know what gravity is, and so we need to have a variable gravity. And we just set that to 9.8. And I'm tightening this up. I will add the gravity, but I multiply that with delta. That is our little number here, the difference between the previous iteration of physics process and the current one. And I don't set that as just a constant here, but increasingly so. And that kind of roughly imitates what gravity feels like or how gravity would behave physically. Okay, as a final thing, I would like to export the speed and the gravity so I can actually see that in the inspector over there. When I add my world and I have my player and I select the player, I can actually see speed and gravity here being displayed, and I could change it here. I could modify that here, and that's good. Okay, so let's start the scene, and now I can basically move left and right and up and down, I called it, but forward and backward really, and I can also fall off the edge. Okay, this is all for today. We have a basic third-person controller, and we also explored the essence of how to write one. In the next video, we will add more detail to it. Please like and subscribe and hit the bell so you do not miss anything. Leave a comment for feedback and for requests. And mind yourself, and see you soon.